Welcome back. We are discussing the ethical, legal, and financial considerations of genomics. And genomics and our new understanding of genetics and genomic science has the potential for a lot of misapplication, a lot of ethical um, and legal problems. So let's talk about a few of the following. Genetic discrimination. Can your genetic testing results be used against you by your employer, your insurance company, in other areas? We'll talk a little bit about eugenics, or the idea of manipulating the human genome to create a more perfect human. The duty to warn. Because genetic diseases can be transmitted, just the way contagious illness, do we now have a duty to warn people at risk for genetic illness based on the results of a close relative? Versus the privacy of information. If you get genetic testing, is your information private? Who can have access to it? Um, it's sort of an interesting dilemma, and we'll discuss it in detail. Patenting, insurance, issues of equity, access to care. As the technology is explored and things are discovered, who owns the rights to profit off of it? How does insurance cover those new treatments or tests? And who gets to benefit from these advances in genomic science? Then we'll talk a little bit about environmental and intergenerational justice, because not only the human genome, but genomes of other species can be manipulated. And if we start manipulating the human genome, it has impact for future generations. So let's talk first about genetic discrimination. There have actually been cases that have come to court regarding discrimination based on the results of genetic testing. So consider a few of these. In one court case, a young boy was diagnosed with Fragile X, a condition that is marked by intellectual disability, in some cases very similar features to autism spectrum disorder. They tend to have large ears, like a pointed chin, long face, recurrent ear infections, and sinusitis. The family's insurance carrier dropped him from coverage, stating that Fragile X was a pre-existing condition. It existed in his genome before they started filing claims for it and before they discovered what he had. Now that's kind of interesting, because if you consider that the basis for all disease is in your genome, so aren't we all walking around with pre-existing conditions of some kind or another? So certainly if he'd never been tested, the insurance company wouldn't have known that he had Fragile X. I think they were successful in getting coverage for him and getting payment for claims that they made during the time that they were not covered. But it's a very interesting situation. Then we have a case of a social worker who was fired from her job. She confided in a colleague that her mother had Huntington's disease, and her employer decided that she was a risk. She wasn't, she was potentially capable of getting Huntington's. It's a 50% chance, and she might not be able to complete her duties in that job. And she was also successful defending her case. And now there's the case of athletes required by the NCAA to test for sickle cell trait. Well, sickle cell trait is autosomal recessive, but that doesn't mean that people who are carriers never have symptoms. Under extreme stress, for example, the training that college athletes go through, or the training you go through in the armed forces, a kind of boot camp style, very strenuous exercise, as well as like high altitudes, things like that. People who carry the sickle cell trait and don't have sickle cell disease can actually have a sudden death syndrome. They start sickling, and it seems to come from nowhere. So the NCAA decided that every athlete who wants to play in the NCAA sports has to be tested for sickle cell trait, leading to questions of fairness and racial discrimination. Sickle cell trait, as you know, is much more common in African American individuals. So if it's found that you have sickle cell trait, you're not, according to the law, they can't discriminate against you, but subtle decisions, a coach might decide not to put you in play as often, especially when talent scouts are watching. They might decide to give you different positions that are less strenuous. Your training might not be as adequate. They might not put as much time and attention into your success as a college athlete. So you can opt out of it, but then you're kind of saying, you're already, that's kind of a strike against you as well. So we have Gina, This legislation prohibits discrimination in employment practices based on genetic information. So group insurance plans can't mess with your coverage based solely on genetic information. If you have a genetic disorder and it was diagnosed, when you apply for the insurance, it can be considered a pre-existing condition. For example, if you already have Huntington's disease, you're already showing symptoms, you can be excluded from some insurance coverage. It prohibits mandatory testing for genetic disorders. So they can't make you undergo genetic testing to determine your risk. It extends HIPAA protections for genetic information. There's a limit on who can have access to that genetic testing result, but it's not comprehensive. It doesn't protect people against genetic discrimination for life insurance, for example, only health insurance. Life insurance is considered not essential, where health care is considered a right. It does not protect you for long-term care insurance, those like kind of optional benefits that could make a real impact, or disability insurance. And it does not apply to people, and this is a lot of people, who receive health care through TRICARE, which is the military's insurance, Veterans Affairs, and Indian Health Service, which are federally regulated insurers. So it's something, but it's not exhaustive. Now we're going to talk about eugenics, and how people might manipulate the human genome. Formerly, this was associated with limiting the reproductive capacity of people with undesirable traits. And we talked about that in the context of Nazi Germany, in the context of, in this country, people who were hospitalized for mental illness, and that included people who didn't actually have mental illness. People of different races were preferentially sterilized. So, it was a way of limiting the reproductive capacity of people who were found to be undesirable. And there were roots of racism and white supremacism in the practice of eugenics. Now that we have the technology to manipulate the human genome, we worry about things like pre-implantation genetic diagnosis and selecting embryos based on the results of the genetic test. Prenatal testing, selective termination of pregnancy. Presently, if you are found to have a serious disorder, a trisomy, or something that maybe runs in your family, they did a single nucleotide pair analysis and found that you had CF or beta thalassemia or Tay-Sachs, you could terminate your pregnancy on that basis. But as we understand more about the genome and we can select for different traits like intelligence, traits like height, traits like athletic ability, and now that we have the technology to edit genes along the genome to create changes to the DNA, are we going to be seeing an increase in traits that are not essential to life but that are desirable culturally or socially? That is the basis of the documentary Human Nature, which you will watch as part of this week's content. The next ethical issue we want to talk about is duty to warn versus privacy of information. So in other areas of healthcare, it's a little easier to maintain that balance. Unless you have something highly contagious or highly destructive, syphilis, hepatitis, your healthcare information should be private. But with genetics, we know that traits are inherited. So generally speaking, if you have a heart condition, diabetes, obesity, alcoholism, mental health issues, like schizophrenia, your medical information is kept private. It's part of HIPAA. And it overrules the right of another person to know that they're at risk. But in the case of genetic information, the courts have sometimes made different decisions. So in Pate versus Threlkel, a physician was sued. The man had a type of thyroid cancer that was highly heritable. It was like an autosomal dominant thing. And he didn't warn the patient's daughter. And the Supreme Court of Florida sided with the daughter that she had a right to know that she was at risk for this disease. Sometimes they rule differently. Sometimes the person's right to privacy is upheld. The problem is, if you start reporting genetic disorders, who are you obligated to notify? Are you supposed to go just one generation? Is it immediate family? Do you have to, search for a third, fourth? degree relatives, or, think about this. What kinds of diseases can you report? In the case of some illnesses, all diseases have some basis in genetics. Schizophrenia, for example. Are you obligated to tell someone's second cousin that they have schizophrenia because they are at genetic risk of having schizophrenia or having a child with schizophrenia? It gets to be very complicated terrain. And as I said, all disease has its basis in genomics somewhere. As genomic healthcare expands, it's important to know what your responsibilities as a nurse are under the law. Generally, nurses are protected for these duty to warn kind of incidences. Providers who order the testing and receive the results and have to interpret it are more at risk, but it certainly is an issue that you'll have to watch. Okay, financial implications and equity in healthcare. So industries that are involved in genetic testing or developing therapeutics are entitled to patent their product and charge any price they think is acceptable. Any price the market will bear that covers the cost and makes them a profit. In the past, companies have tried to patent genes and gene sequences because they discovered them, but these genes were part of the human genome all along. They've been there forever. So in 2013, the Supreme Court said nobody can patent isolated pieces of DNA in its natural, unmodified form. If it existed in the human genome throughout, human evolution, you can't patent it. You didn't invent it. So other technologies, like if you invent CRISPR, you can have a patent. If you invent a test, you can have a patent, but you can't patent the human genome. As technology incorporates genomics, there will be, for a little while at least, increased cost, and that means some people won't benefit. That lady with the CRISPR experiment with sickle cell anemia benefited because she was part of a trial. But as that therapy becomes part of healthcare, who can access it? Will Medicaid pay for it? Out of pocket, it would be incredibly expensive. Nobody could afford it. And so, we have to consider those questions. Are we at risk of increasing the disparities in healthcare in a country that already has a lot of implicit bias and systemic racism and wide disparities, gender-based disparities? It's worth pondering. Lastly, we're going to talk about environmental, global, and intergenerational justice. As we modify the environment with genomic research, we need to consider the impact our work will have on the environment and future generations. We think it's great to modify our food to be insect resistant or drought resistant and our crops. But once you do that, there's no going back. Those traits are altered indefinitely. Other species, like mosquitoes, it could have effects on the environment that have unintended consequences, and that could go on indefinitely. Editing germline cells has a direct impact on future generations, so whatever we do to try and improve our situation means that, we've got to consider the impact on generation 7 or 8, generations from now. So consider the dilemma of addressing malaria on the African continent. Mosquitoes carry malaria. Malaria kills one child in Africa every 75 seconds. There is a vaccine for it, Malarix, but it's new. Killing mosquitoes reduces the burden of disease, right? It makes sense. DDT kills mosquitoes very effectively, very cheaply, but it also alters the human genome in somatic and germline cells. It alters DNA in many other species, so if you spray it everywhere, there are consequences to the human genome and the genomes of other species that will last throughout the generations from now on. So the WHO calls for controlled application of DDT in countries where malaria is common. Some countries, the risk, does not outweigh the benefits. So DDT will save many more lives than the potential or theoretical risk of altering the human genome by the use of DDT. It isn't the best strategy, but it's the strategy we have. And in those countries where it's so common, they call for it. Now there's a research project that's using CRISPR technology to alter mosquitoes so they become infertile, and any mosquito who mates with them also becomes infertile. So you can actually potentially eradicate all the mosquitoes in the world. So mosquitoes carry malaria, but they also pollinate plants, and they're a food source for a lot of other organisms. So if we eradicate mosquitoes, what impact does that have on environmental health and the ecosystem? And this is what I mean when, you make one decision and you think it's a good idea. 7 generations later, we might be looking back and saying, hey, that was a disaster, and that's why we have X, Y, and Z. And now let's look at it through the lens. We have Mercy Week coming up. Mercy values, critical concerns. We have a duty to the earth. We have a call to nonviolence. We need to act with integrity and fight for social justice. These are the things that make up the critical concerns of the Sisters of Mercy. And you're here at Gwynedd Mercy University. So let's see. How do you make an ethical, just decision here? There are some choices. You can look for other pesticides with lower risks. They might not be as effective, and you can subsidize those pesticides. You can use DDT to control malaria and find ways to mitigate the risk of DDT. Maybe you confine it to certain areas. Or you could use CRISPR, get rid of your mosquitoes, and hope that other insects will take their place in the food chain, in the biosystem. Or we could look at ways to make genes less susceptible to malaria. Now, the fifth solution, which actually, is already kind of in place, is to give people a vaccine to malaria. And that has happened in several African countries. So, you want to make the least impact on the environment, on the human genome, and still eradicate this horrible disease that kills many, many people each day. All right. Thank you for joining me for this week. You're going to watch the documentary called Human Nature, and I will see you again next Thursday.